Okay, looks like I'm alive. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of the Richard Dolan Show. I want to thank all of you for being here, and definitely let you know that we've got Tracy in the chat room, along with our usual fantastic hosts from the RD Members website, and of course, our friends over at Pursuing X. Welcome. I see there's, pardon me, folks in the chat room already from around the world. That's always great to see. One quick reminder for those of you who may not know, if you haven't been following lately, but I did recently just publish a new book. I want to show you a picture of it here. That's called The Alien Agendas, a speculative analysis of those visiting Earth. It's been out for a couple of weeks. Getting some positive feedback on it. Corrected a couple of typos in the very, very first printing. It's inevitable. Some very, very kind and diligent people let me know about that. And I was just able to re-upload some changes to the ebook and to the print version at the same time. Audiobook of that is in the works. That should be ready, I think, within a week or two. Well, let's say a couple of weeks, but it is definitely on the way, along with audiobooks of a number of my other books that I've written in the past. That includes volume 1 and 2 of UFOs in the National Security State. Those audiobooks are, one of them is done and the other one is in process. Audiobook version of UFOs for the 21st Century Mind is on the agenda, as well as some of the booklets that I've done. So, and there's already an audio version of AD After Disclosure, which has been out for some time. And that's a book I'm going to talk a little bit about with you this evening. So let me jump right in. We're in the year 2020, and I know we're all looking forward to it being in the rearview mirror soon enough. Of course, who knows what 2021 is going to bring us. But 2020 has certainly been a year of surprises. I mean, aside from the global meltdown and transformation in, let's see, economics, politics, individual freedom, civility, technocracy, warfare. There's been a revolution in warfare this year. If you haven't been paying attention, there's been something else also that has had a big impact this year. But unless you've really been paying attention, you can be forgiven for having missed it, since we've had so much else going on. But that extra something has been important developments in our public discussion of UFOs, or UAP as they're now often called in the media and by the military. Everything is upside down. So because of that, the UFO revelations haven't gotten the attention I think they would have gotten in any other year. Now, 10 years ago, I co-authored a book called AD After Disclosure in 2010. I can't believe a whole decade has gone by. Back then, neither me nor my co-author, Bryce Zabel, could really have imagined such a low-key response to the revelations that have appeared over these past 3 years. So let me go back in time for a little bit with you. Just a decade ago. Like, I don't know how it seems to some of you. To me, 10 years ago doesn't seem like a long time ago, but my God, in some ways, it feels like 1,000 years ago. But just 10 years ago, UFOs were every bit as relegated to the fringes of public discussion as they had ever been. The lid seemed to be screwed down tight. Only in 2008, Dennis Kucinich, who was trying to win the Democratic Party nomination for president, some of you remember that, had his campaign completely derailed because it came out that he, God forbid, had seen a UFO like 25 years earlier, like in the early 1980s. And this was a problem for him, even though his two co-witnesses from that time went public in 2008 to support him and said, yes, yeah, we were there. We saw it just like he did. None of that mattered. The media lampooned him for it. So during all of those years, and it wasn't that long ago, it felt virtually impossible for researchers, pardon me, a little frog in my throat here, to make, it felt impossible for researchers to make any kind of genuine breakthrough in getting the subject of UFOs any real traction in terms of credibility with the establishment, with the established institutions. And it wasn't through a lack of trying, and it wasn't through a lack of data. Researchers, not just myself, but many, many others had easily documented countless genuine and high-quality UFO encounters, often by the United States military, as well as by militaries of many other nations. So to anyone paying attention, the evidence that was put forward was actually overwhelming and easily deserving of a public hearing. And yet, I felt, and I think a lot of my colleagues felt, that we were just howling into the wind. Now, sure, there was lots of television shows dealing with UFOs. Some were better than others. Some were worse than others. All of them probably helped to keep the subject percolating along with the public to some degree. And that's a weird thing when you really think about where UFOs were 10 years ago, because they were definitely a significant subculture around the world, even a decade ago. You could consider it like a niche market that TV producers definitely wanted to cater to. They knew it was a big enough market. They wanted to create a product for that market. It was a very strange place for UFOs to be in this, because you really think about it, there are not that many niche markets whose reality was officially denied by, the powers that be for so long, so strenuously, so consistently. That's a really weird thing. Like, UFOs were in this very strange in-between place in our culture as something that did exist and did not exist at the same time. It's very bizarre. So when Bryce and I wrote AD, we saw the situation as inherently unstable. So the reality of the phenomenon was undeniable to us. That is, we'd both been delving into it long enough to know this. We also knew there was a longstanding cover-up of this reality, a denial that was imposed by you could say, the dictates of national security, and even, you might argue, the dictates of global stability, at least in the minds of those people who were managing the secret. Clearly, that's how they have seen it. On the one side of it, you got this overwhelming, powerful reality, something of greater importance than anything else that we could imagine. Aliens, or others, as we called them in our book, were here among us from somewhere else with clearly advanced capabilities, interacting with us, interacting with this world in ways that we were still struggling to understand, but which we knew was of monumental importance. So that's on the one side. On the other side of it, we noticed a near total banishment of this reality from our officially sanctioned forms of public conversation. That is, legacy media, the universities, and certainly the world of politics all just ignored UFOs. They were totally silent. And when they weren't silent, they had a really great knack for sounding completely idiotic, stupid, ignorant, even juvenile when they did talk about it. I mean, embarrassingly so, frequently. Now, there are often disconnects between what's actually going on in the world and the conversations that we have about those things. They're not always the same. A lot of times we say one thing, we're given an official version of reality about it, and the actual reality is totally different. And that's actually in probably every society. But the disconnect in the case of UFOs, I always thought, was simply unmatched by anything else that I could imagine. You have this divide between these astonishing objects, this powerful reality of UFOs and the beings associated with them on the one side, and then the deafening silence and the disinformation officially spewed out about them was simply on another order of magnitude compared with anything else that I could think of. So this is why back in 2010, 10 years ago, I thought that the end of UFO secrecy was a paradox. I said this all the time. I felt that UFO secrecy was impossible, or I mean the end of UFO secrecy was impossible and inevitable at the same time. So impossible because there just seemed to be no motivation from those in power, those with control over this secret, to want to rock the boat with something so inherently destabilizing as this knowledge. Anyone who's looked at this for long enough, like, that's easy to see that this is a destabilizing kind of reality and a subject matter, something that had implications, I mean, not just about the very nature of our place in the universe, yes. Our place here on planet Earth, yes, absolutely. But I mean, understanding the UFO reality and breaking through that conspiracy of silence has implications for scientific breakthroughs that could change life as we know it. It could create changes in the world's energy paradigm and financial paradigm, can open up the whole question of being lied to for an entire human lifetime, surely in a way that implies a lot of illegality and even criminality along the way. All of that would come out with the end of UFO secrecy. So like, why in God's name would anyone voluntarily open up that whole can of worms? In the long run, you can easily make an argument that the end of secrecy eventually would be beneficial to the human race. But you could easily see an argument that in the medium and short terms, that there'd be a lot of disruption and trouble in our world as a result of it. And yet, there always seemed to be the inevitability of the end of secrecy. I always held the view that, nothing can last forever, certainly not a secret this big. And considering the rapid changes that were already taking place around the world, even a decade ago, all right, it just seemed to me that all that volatility and all the change could easily open up new opportunities for leaks to break out and to create real problems for the cause of secrecy. So in 2010, we could believe, it sounds comical and horribly sad at the same time when I say this, but in 2010, we could still believe in the power of social media to disseminate information in a free and uncensored manner. Like we could believe in the power of organizations like WikiLeaks, maybe, to hit a home run and get some powerful leak of UFO-related information that would break things open. This is how we were thinking in 2010. Or even, in 2010, now that people around the world were getting smartphones with halfway decent cameras on them, maybe Bryce and I we wondered that there might be a UFO sighting that might just be captured on enough multiple devices and uploaded to show a craft so clearly, that it would be impossible any longer to deny that this was real. Like that, these are the kinds of things, because all of us in 2010 were really quite new. Social media was fairly new. Smartphones were new. All the ways that we communicate now, they existed in 2010, but they were new. And I think it was hard for everyone to see where this was all going to go. So what we saw, in other words, were two powerful forces on either side: an overwhelming, powerful reality of UFOs and aliens on one side, and an intense cover-up on the other, all in a world that was in rapid change, and obviously with only more changes coming up and ahead. Anyone could see that. So in many ways, when I look back at what we wrote in that book, I think we nailed it right on the head. The leaks that we foresaw have started to happen. They didn't happen the way that we speculated. In other words, I was thinking that the leaks would come from a force completely outside the power elite that would smash through the denials, like hackers like Anonymous or WikiLeaks or something like that. That is how I will just say I envisioned it. And that's not what has happened. Instead, what we've seen is a group of people with their own inside connections to that world of intelligence, to the world of military. I'm talking basically about the people in TTSA and those associated with Robert Bigelow and their various allies. Now, I know everyone's got their own opinions on this. To this day, this is like such a crazy, polarizing topic, but I'm just going to tell you yet again, my opinion has not changed in a long time about them. I see them as a faction from within that world, a faction with allies and with enemies, who are trying in their way to be as ultra careful in navigating their path to release information. Is it self-serving? Yeah, probably. But is it helpful to us to get this information out? Absolutely. Absolutely it is. But anyway, that's even aside from the point. The thing that we said in our book was that although we couldn't predict how leaks were likely to happen, that we did believe strongly that it would be virtually inevitable that someone somehow was going to make some leaks. And that did happen. And in terms of timeline, I just want to say this. We didn't really create a timeline in our book as to like when we thought things were going to break open. But I will tell you in my own mind, back in 2010, I was thinking 10 years would not be outrageous to think that something could break open. Maybe 20 years, but maybe 10. And I was always open to the fact that something could be happening by this time. And I do think it's fair to say that Bryce thought the same thing. And, you know, it just seemed very feasible to us. So good on us for those parts of our predictions. Now, what we did not see, well, for sure, what I did not see was the lack of an avalanche effect. All right. So my feeling had always been that because the denial was so strong for so long regarding UFOs, you know, this lid was down tight, decade after decade, that it was a denial and a secrecy that seemed strong, but was actually potentially very brittle. And so that a really good hammer, a really good bit of evidence, a really good leak, something like that, could be the thing that could shatter that secrecy. So that what I guess I believed is that any major breach in that narrative would prove fatal, and would prove fatal relatively quickly. This is how I thought. So that would be the avalanche effect, you know. So like if there were to be any official admission that some of these UFOs were truly not from our society, this is how I thought. I absolutely assumed that if there was an official admission that these UFOs were not ours, that there would be immediate, powerful questions coming at the elites from, don't laugh, from the media. So, for example, questions like, you know, how have you kept this secret for so long? Or what have you learned about these things or these other beings or their science? And, you know, show us the bodies and all of that stuff. And on and on. So I believe that at least then, I believe that an admission of the UFO reality would pretty much immediately lead to an implicit admission of cover-up, which would in turn lead people to question all sorts of other narratives like 9/11 or the thousands of other lies that make up the whole edifice of our officially sanctioned fairy tale reality that we're all supposed to be living in. So what I did not see, what I simply could not possibly have imagined, is what has happened. That we are in the most incredibly tepid and lame version of disclosure that I can imagine. Now, I mean, tepid and lame on one side of it. There are a lot of things coming out. So these little bombs coming out. So that's not tepid. That's not lame. But what is tepid and lame is our discussion of those revelations. And I just did not think that the military or the establishment would ever be able to get away with what they have actually gotten away with up till now. What they have been able to do is to admit that, yes, there are UFOs, and at the same time, they don't know what they are. That is the thing. To be able to state in 2020, yes, there are these UAP, and yes, we don't know what they are. Now, 10 years ago, I thought that such a situation like that would be so ridiculous. It would be too ridiculous even to consider, which is why we never considered it in our book. Like, how could anyone, I wondered, ever buy the fiction that the United States military has dealt with UFOs for generations, including certain like incredible dramatic military encounters that by themselves could be the subject of quite a few really great movies. All right. How could they do all of that and pretend that they have no idea what these things are? Like, who, I wondered, could be so stupid as to accept that? And on top of this, there were so many compelling leaks that had been out for years that concerned retrievals of downed UFOs, even the retrieval of alien bodies, and maybe a few live aliens also. All of those stories have been seeping out of the military world for years and years. And I just thought, like, were people simply going to pretend that these rumors never existed? So, like, if there was an admission, my assumption had always been there would be people who would latch right onto those stories. In other words, I assumed that people would ask logical questions and that the journalists for mainstream media would ask those questions. And even if they didn't ask them, because even then, like, mainstream media was obviously ultra corporate controlled and horrible in every way, but I still worked on the assumption that they would be driven to it by the alternative media, which would simply be leading the charge and force the establishment into asking these questions. So at least on a good day, that's what I thought could really possibly happen. And that's why I thought there would be an avalanche effect. So the thing is, let me put it this way, if the recent revelations of UFOs, like that, the revelations we've been getting since 2017, if those had happened in 2010 instead of now, like, I think it's entirely possible that what I was imagining could actually have happened. That avalanche could have happened. But a lot has changed in the last 10 years, and really in the last 5 years. The big thing being massive consolidation of power over digital media by big tech, which is completely in bed, of course, with what we now often call the deep state, what I have often called the national security state. The deep, widespread censorship and control that now exists is beyond anything that I could have imagined even a decade ago. Like, I think we all knew that this was on the way, right? I think that I did. I talked about it. But the swiftness that it's happened, I think that has caught me off guard. And also, the pushing of alternative media so rapidly to the fringes has happened a little bit more dramatically and rapidly than I thought would happen, or at least a little sooner than I thought would happen. I will say that. It's not that the genuine alternative media has completely gone away, but it's definitely been given a body blow in the last 5 or so years. And, obviously the internet more and more is resembling fewer and fewer authoritative voices that are dominated by major corporations. And by the way, that phrase, authoritative news, like, you hear this from big tech all the time. And it just, every time, decent people hear it, I think it just makes them throw up a little bit. It's a horrible phrase. And, I really wonder, are the people using that phrase, are they aware or not aware of how it sounds like authoritarian? Are they aware of the irony? Are they aware of, it's not really irony. Are they just aware that they are actively pushing authoritarianism? I think the answer is probably yes, unless some who are just so brain dead that they don't even realize it. But anyway, that's the internet we're looking at, authoritative voices that dominate everything. So what that means is that control over the narrative is vastly more possible today than it was a decade ago. No question about that. And so what that means is that establishment publications and establishment digital media that write about this subject, UFOs, that they can go very, very slowly in this. They have that luxury. And I'm not saying that all the journalists involved are willfully trying to play along with the cover-up. I actually don't believe that that is the case. But they are being mindful of who they work for, absolutely. And they are well aware of how far they feel safe in exploring the deep implications of this reality. And these implications are very deep. So last week, there was a very interesting article by Tim McMillan detailing the classified report from 2020 of the UAP task force. This is something that, of course, was announced last June. Again, those of you who've been paying attention to the UFO field are aware of this. It's a very important development. And that task force has had a classified report circulating around, which apparently is, in a sense, gone viral among a number of people in the intelligence community because it's got some very explosive statements and data inside it. And McMillan wrote about it. It's a very important article, and I'm glad he wrote it. Now, the interesting things about that report, basically, you've got intelligence analysts talking about the potential otherworldly nature of UFOs. So they're really basically coming right out, including the belief that at least some, I should say, belief of some of these high-level officials that these objects originate from within the world's oceans. Like, that's an amazing thing to read about. This report includes the possession, we are told, and I'm expecting we're going to see this leak out at some point, of a superb quality photograph, we're told, of a triangular UFO exiting the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the article, I think, makes it pretty clear that there's really no power on Earth, there's no nation on Earth that can account for this type of technology, something that can exit the ocean and fly through the atmosphere. We don't have anything that we know can do that. And I don't think that we even know how that science would work, or if there's a theoretical understanding of the science, there's certainly not an engineering and practical understanding of how to do it. So the article, I would say, comes very close to a conclusion that UFOs are extraterrestrial, or at least, let's say, something not from our civilization at any rate, because there are people who think extraterrestrial is just too simplistic of an explanation, but we'll just say something other, something not from us. But here's the thing. Like all the journalism on this subject for the past 3 years, it doesn't explicitly state the obvious. All right, so you're still left with, in this kind of make-believe fantasy world of, we don't know what these things are. And this is the thing that I just could not have fathomed 10 years ago. I admit it. But it is where we are today. We have achieved, I think it's fair to say that we have achieved a partial disclosure of the UFO reality. And that's not trivial. Not at all. But the avalanche has not occurred. And I think there's a few reasons why that's turned out to be the case, why that avalanche has not happened. So one is that there, to this day, is still zero appreciation of the long history of this UFO phenomenon, at least in the modern era. It's as if UFO history started in 2004 with the Tic Tac UFO encounter, as if nothing had ever happened until then. This blows my mind, honestly. It's not that no one has discussed it at all. I mean, I've talked about it many times, and I continue to do so, and there are other voices on the fringes who do so as well. Although honestly, it doesn't seem like many people, frankly. But there are some. There have been a few people talking about it, and the fact is that there are quite a few examples of Tic Tac UFOs being encountered many decades ago. That is, objects described in virtually the same manner as the Tic Tac UFO of 2004, but back in the 1950s, the 1960s, even further back, the 1940s there were. I found one such case from 1936 in the Canadian National Archives many years ago. I've talked about this many times. These objects, all of them, have had the ability to accelerate to incredible speeds instantaneously from a hovering position. This is not anything new. Quite a few of those types of instances, by the way, are in military reports, especially some good ones from the 1940s. We've gone over these so many times that those of us who feel as though we're just like repeating, I feel like I'm repeating the same thing over and over. But again, it's as if they never happened, except that they did happen. So by cutting out the history of all of that, all of these dramatic and sometimes terrifying military encounters, and sometimes not military, like there's just been a tremendous amount of very well documented observations by very qualified ordinary people that are incredible sightings. And none of this, or very little of it, I should say, seems to be getting much attention in our conversation here. So when we're not talking about these things, we're doing ourselves a great disservice because we are removing some of the most important evidence available to us that gives us insight into this long, long cover-up of information about UFOs. Now, I do want to congratulate filmmaker James Fox on his film Phenomenon, which does cover the history of this in a really nice way in a film version. So great for James that he did that. Great for us that he did that. And there are other voices, but by and large, I think what I'm saying here stands, that within the journalistic conversation, within the establishment conversation, this history just is not coming out. And because of that, because that history has just been expunged, this whole attitude of we don't know what they are continues. And it's worth pointing out that attitude of we don't know what they are, that was discredited back in the 1970s, okay? Because that's when researchers for the first time had access to declassified government documents on UFOs that proved once and for all that this was a serious national security concern for them, and that they were not responsible for these objects, nor was any other nation on earth responsible for these objects. You go through those declassified documents, Freedom of Information, starting really in the mid-70s, and it becomes clear as day that this was going on there. So, and in fact, that's why I called Volume 2 of UFOs in the National Security State. I subtitled it The Cover-Up Exposed, because it really was during the 70s and 80s that the cover-up was exposed by those revealed documents. Like, people were able to prove that there was a cover-up. They were able to expose it. They weren't able to defeat it, but they were able to expose it. So anyway, my question to you is, are you actually able to believe in all seriousness that the military has been spinning its wheels on this problem for 70 plus years and not acquired any evidence to give them a clue about what is going on? Like, who actually believes that? So partly because of this lack of history from establishment sources, there's been no public outcry that is forcing the political establishment to address this issue. And that's a whole other part of the problem. And yes, we know our political establishment has been utterly, hopelessly corrupt for the longest time. But it's still a political establishment that, there's this idea they're supposed to respond to the people. And don't give up on that idea, no matter how rotten that system is. All right? Because we have to make this system respond to us. And it's never going to respond perfectly. We all know that. But when there's enough strength coming from the people, we can make things happen. And when we force something as significant as the UFO secret out into the open, a lot of other things are going to be able to happen. All right. So back to our situation right now. So we have one in which the U.S. Navy, the Pentagon, have made some admissions about UFOs. And those are significant. But, the president hasn't been forced into saying anything because no one is presenting the facts of the matter in a way to force a proper response. In today's world, no one's going to be swayed by anything going on with the alternative independent media anymore. I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but alternative media has been kept and pushed to the sidelines even more than it was a decade ago. The establishment media, on the other hand, despite the fact that no one even pays attention to the establishment media, this is the weird thing. Like, who really watches legacy TV news anymore, really? But yet they have been able, despite the fact that they are irrelevant in terms of the information that they provide, hopelessly behind the curve on everything that the alternative independent media does. And yet they have been able to manage this narrative, this tepid UFO dialogue, this information extremely well. And as a result, the difficult questions are just not being asked. So what happens next? That's the question. Well, even the establishment media is being pushed more and more into acknowledging this reality. And it is becoming harder and harder to avoid questions of cover-up and even conspiracy. Now, so far, no one has gone there, at least not that I can see, at least in the establishment legacy media. However, it's a lot easier to see this happening now than at any other point in our history. As one, I guess I can call him an insider, as one insider said to me, each new revelation is just more toothpaste out of the tube. So the avalanche moment that we imagined in AD after disclosure has not happened yet. But that is not to say that it won't happen. Even over this last year, I've gone back and forth on this question, like, will it happen? Will it not happen? Earlier this year, I wondered openly if there's just going to be a big red stop sign to this whole movement of new information coming out on UFOs. And fortunately, it turned out to be wrong. So there has been more coming out, and it is entirely possible that there will be more to come in the future. So is that to say that UFO secrecy's end is coming? I don't know when that will happen. I do think that the end of UFO secrecy still is inevitable. I do think that. That is not to say that by the end of secrecy that I think all the secrets are going to come out. I don't think that. I don't think that's realistic at all. And in fact, I never thought that was realistic. I've always envisioned UFO secrecy as a mountain, and the end of secrecy as the government handing us a little sliver of that mountain. But the sliver that admits that there's been something that they've been covering up and that they are not responsible for, like this reality is something beyond our civilization. And I think we will get to that point. I think we're getting closer and closer to that point. Now, the thing is, whenever we do get that sliver, that admission, we've got to recognize that there's going to be an enormous reality that will undoubtedly remain concealed from us. And this is why I've always believed that disclosure isn't the end of the struggle against UFO secrecy. It's really just going to be another stage in the ongoing struggle to learn the full truth. But it will be important. Even if it's not complete, it will still be important, because at least then we're going to be able to keep probing into the matter in the public discussion, because UFOs will be a valid topic of conversation. They're already becoming one. I think we can say now they have become one. UFOs are a valid, non-jokey topic to talk about in the public domain. It's kind of an amazing thing. We've actually gotten there. I think at this point, anyone who sneers and jokes at UFOs, which was only happening just a couple of years ago, that the joke's on them and that they're the ones who look like fools now. And I think they know that. So there's really been a significant sea change in that. But we still have a long way to go. But when that admission does come out, like a formal admission, we will be able to use that, I think, and whatever leverage that we can muster up to keep learning more. So right now, we're at a very interesting point. It's now becoming recognized that UFOs or UAP are real and that they don't seem to be explained conventionally. So we're there. And, you know, those of us who've been studying this subject know that there is much, much, much more to all of this. And if you look if you look closely at statements made by members of TTSA or those scientists closely affiliated with them, I'm leaving all names out right now, but if you're paying attention, you know exactly who I mean, then it is obvious that they know that there have been retrievals of UFOs that are being studied, that almost certain possession of alien bodies. You know, Edgar Mitchell, who was one of that crowd, one of them, stated this for years, openly, that there's technology and bodies being studied. But anyway, they all know it, and many of the journalists who've covered them, they know this as well. And yet no one's talking. No one's going there. It's really worth asking, what are they waiting for? And I'm not really talking about anyone to make a definitive pronouncement that UFOs are real and yes, they're alien in some way. That would be nice. I'm just talking about anyone in that group to ask some slightly more challenging questions about all of this. And there are scarcely anyone doing it. I think there's a couple of people out there who are trying to probe this, and they've gone quiet as well. So we're definitely not there. We're inching our way, little baby steps. What I'm really curious about is how this is going, like whenever we get to that tipping point, how it will happen, what will be the real cause of that. And then, of course, what happens after that. And those are the exact questions that Bryce and I asked 10 years ago. The thing is, the end of UFO secrecy in 2010 and in 2020 remains the single most radical, revolutionary thing that I can think of. The implications are every bit as profound for a lot of the reasons that I've just discussed here and quite a few others. And so it remains a volatile topic. But here's the thing. What is happening in our world now, the year of the lockdown, is a dramatic, rapid reset and reorganization of all of global society. And this includes far, far more severe population controls than any of us could have imagined even 1 year ago. And I do wonder if this actually might make it convenient from a UFO disclosure point of view. You think about this. Because all that craziness that we imagined in our book, and we imagined a lot, like we just saw, you know, the end of UFO secrecy turning human society upside down, inside out, right? Cultural transformation, scientific revolutions, political blowback, you know, even like in the world of media and academia, like recriminations against all the people complicit with that. We talked about all of it. But in the year of the lockdown and what lies ahead of us in 2021 and beyond, all of that craziness that we imagined is going to be a lot easier to control in a virtual totalitarian surveillance and control society that is rapidly being constructed all around us. So in other words, by the time that we get some sort of admission on the alien nature of UFOs, the state and national lockdowns that people are experiencing, those may or may not be in effect, the physical lockdowns, but the lockdown on ideas, the lockdown on speech, the lockdown on citizen action, that I can assure you will be much more severe than it even is today. So that's a great way to manage an inherently volatile backlash that would come with UFO disclosure. I used to say that, if disclosure came to a global fascist technocratic society, that I'd prefer to opt out and just, put me on a spaceship to the moon, because I wouldn't want to live on such an Earth. What good is UFO disclosure if you've lost your most precious freedom, right? Well, my friends, that appears to be our trajectory. I don't want it to be that way, but as each month passes, as each year passes, it just looks more and more to be the case. And by the way, I wrote about a lot of these issues in my latest book, The Alien Agendas. I talk about a theory that I've been just working. I call it the fourth stage of humanity. 300,000 years of humans living as hunters and gatherers, and the last 10, 15,000 years of having agriculture and settled societies and writing and the wheel and cities and, nation states and all of that. And then the last 300 years of science and technology, that's the third stage, right? And we're moving into something very different right now. And I call it the fourth stage. And I think at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, I speculated that COVID was, or the response to COVID actually was hastening our transformation into this fourth stage. But I think there's no question about it now. I think that it is moving us very definitively to it. That's a completely different world of everything being digitized, including you, including me, including all of your actions, including all of your money, including everything that you can imagine, digitized, commodified, surveilled, controlled, ideologically bludgeoned on a constant basis. A conformist society that's basically going to be modeled on China and their social credit trustworthiness system. I think we're a decade at most behind them now. I think we're very clearly moving toward that. So it's a genius system of totalitarian control that has never been achieved by the wildest dreams of the greatest, worst dictators. Like, they've never been able to achieve what we're seeing rolled out, not just in China, but globally in Western societies as well. So we're seeing this transformation. It's happened so fast. And I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts here. So one thought is, when you look through the history of the battle against UFO secrecy in the Western world, right, what you will find is that, well, it never took place in authoritarian societies. It didn't take place in the Soviet Union. It hasn't taken place in China. There's no battle against UFO secrecy in those societies or any other totalitarian or dictatorship type of society. It just doesn't happen. The only places where there has actually ever been genuine progress in opening up the UFO subject has been in democratic societies, where there's been a certain amount of freedom for people to engage in and to research and to explore. All right. And we're moving away from that really fast. We haven't moved away from it 100%, but that window is closing. And when that window closes, ask yourself, what will be the means and techniques and strategies of UFO disclosure when you live in a fully, openly authoritarian society? Because that's a question that people living in the West really have not asked, and that I think we're going to have to start asking that question. Some of the smarter folks listening right now, I would really ask you, we're going to need some creative solutions in the future. Disclosure within an authoritarian system. And challenging that narrative that inevitably will be laid down. My view has always been UFO secrecy has to end because the world is just moving in too many places. We've got too much going on, and the old secrets are becoming ridiculously antiquated to maintain. So new information has got to come out to revise the old. And that's easy for them to do in an authoritarian system, which is what they are moving us into pedal to the metal right at this point. So we need to start coming up with creative new ideas about how to move a disclosure agenda forward if that is something that people care about. For me, I fought the idea of disclosure for the longest time. I thought disclosure, that sounds very premature to me. This is, like 15 plus years ago. I just thought, let's talk about just, the facts on the ground rather than speculate about what the future is going to bring. But I've certainly come to feel that talking about disclosure is valuable, because all that UFO disclosure means is fighting the secrecy on this subject. And it is a secret that's had a very pernicious effect on our society in general. And it's not that there aren't unsettling realities about this UFO phenomenon. I think it's entirely possible that that is true. And we have to consider that, right? But we're also at a point where it's just becoming deeply impractical to expect that this is a secret that's got much longer of a shelf life. I just don't think it does. So that's what I've got for you. With that, I want to thank all of you for coming out here, all the chat family, all the wonderful people who have supported Tracy and me all this time. Thank you. Thank you so very much. I don't think we'd be able to do what we do without your support. And I just want you all to know that we are very grateful for that. I'm going to catch you next time. I'll be back. In the meantime, let's all keep fighting the good fight. Later.